my latest thing, and I'll get to this a little later, is from another producer. I heard about oregano for face fly control, and I've just started that, and I'm seeing results already, and I've only been feeding it about a week now. So like I say, we'll get into those things a little bit later. I am going to move on pretty fast. I have lots of slides, but we're gonna try to roll right on through them. My dad bought this farm, or pieces of it, piece by piece, back in the 60s, and I touch on the evolution of it. But he had about 300 cows in that. They're not all pictured there, but in that picture on the left. And we used to cut hay, and he did good grazing management, but grazed a little too long and a little too short, and didn't have as long a rest periods, recovery periods as I'd like to see. So he commented to me one time, how did you do this? And whenever I increased production without fertilizer, and I want to preface that I really encourage people to balance their fertility. But once you get it balanced, cycling the nutrients is pretty easy if you do this high density, short duration grazing, because so much more hits the surface of the pasture than in the shade. So you get value out of it. One on the right is just my multi-species, where we're moving down a road, county road, to another paddock. You can see a few dogs scattered in there. So we'll move right on. I like to start with a goal, and my goal for my operation is listed here. But anytime I'm working with people, I want to know their goals so I know better how to advise them. But I'm striving for a healthy, low stress, low cost grazing operation that is productive, improves the environment and life while being consistently profitable. So I think it's important that we know that. A note too of this picture, some of these are older pictures. That's temporary fence there. Now I've got the cap of that hill fenced off as a sacrifice area, so that I can hold them on it. And there's not many farms in my visits through the years that have a great sacrifice area, holding area, for when their grazing heights are at the minimum height, so they could hold them back, feed hay, and then move on. So so anyway, that's the gyration of that little picture there. Here we're showing some multi-species moving through some turnips that I've grazed. I've got a note there: livestock preferences vary according to experience and management. In this case, you see not many of them grazing, even though those turnips look really good. It's because they weren't familiar with them, and they avoided them. Once they got used to them, they grazed them good. Of course, they're such high nutrient quality that we want to monitor how much and limit how much turnip they get. That could be time limit graze, or feed some hay along with it. But some reasons for the grazing management and the multi-species grazing is the weed control, the nutrient cycling, hay savings, and they don't avoid each other's poop, like sheep will graze next to cattle poop, and vice versa. They serve as vacuums for each other's internal parasites. I believe it was Idaho State that did a research and increased their stocking rate 24% by adding sheep to a cattle operation. Of course, sheep can be bred earlier, have a shorter gestation, higher ratio of lamb weight to mother's weight than cattle, and we can increase our income. Sheep are usually higher than cattle, and then if you pick your markets, and then goats are even higher. Species of animal that you might run are dependent on what plant species you have. Like goats like browse. If you don't have browse, there's not much reason to have goats, in my opinion, because of the trouble that they have. They're a wimpy animal species, more prone to internal parasites and foot disorders. Of course, there's good and bad in every breed and every species. the sheep more on forbs, like they'll eat a horse nettle better than a goat will. They'll eat the buttercup better than goats. But goats are better on multiflora and briars and things like that. And then cattle, and of course, are prone to like the grass and clover and the tall growth, whereas sheep and goats don't like to walk over into that tall growth, and that's because they're a prey species. But of course, they'll graze whatever they have in front of them. It doesn't mean that they're not going to just all graze grass if that's all they have. But I like to adjust the livestock species to the vegetation. So a lot of people that start off in goats will go to sheep, and then later may just have cattle. That's just a picture there of some summer annuals grazing, and you can see it's pretty normal for the sheep, goats, and cattle to segregate somewhat, but be in the same paddock. And just another picture. I love Johnson grass because that's what just about every species will graze first. Sheep will graze clover before they graze grass. Goats don't like clover typically that much. They will eat some, but not all that much. So you can increase white clover where you have goats grazing with cattle. There's a dung fly. I'm big on diversity even in the wildlife, and that's a spring fly that's beneficial for fly control. That's a walk-through fly trap that was researched back in the 50s to keep flies at an economic threshold, which is about 200 flies per cow. I don't use that so much since I've gotten on the garlic, but I do move it when I'm near a water source, and I make them go through this to get to the water at that water source, and we'll move it from field to field there. Just showing some more diversity in the summer annuals. Here's some alfalfa and chicory and ryegrass. Looks like there's a thistle over there to the left, and then you know, we've shaded out thistle and buttercup with the diverse mix of summer, or with annuals, when be your vine trials like all winter and hairy veg, and for summer cowpeas, soybean, chocolate, and more mature and smother out. Here's some crabgrass, one of my favorite grasses of the annuals. Here I grazed some land extra hard because I didn't like the composition of that pasture, and I got a lot of crabgrass in that field. With higher grazing, you don't get much crabgrass, and that's a bit of an issue in fescue country because crabgrass is very beneficial in the summer. Here's some crimson clover and Austrian winter peas and ryegrass, and you see some brassicas going to seed back there, and there's some oats in there. Oats have the most mycorrhiza activity of any of the winter annuals. So again, diversity, it spreads out the growth, and it gives the animals more selectivity, and increases the quality of their diet. White clover, we tend to underestimate the quality of white clover because all of it is leaf. The stem is on the ground. That's the stolon. So it's even higher quality than alfalfa, especially when alfalfa is stemmy. So, but we say 30 to 50% clover in a stand is desirable. We need to keep grass in there. However, it's based on dry weight of the clover, so it appears to be more clover in order to get that 30 to 50. So it look like 50% out there is what my point is. Here's something kind of cool I did last year is I added cucurbits. This was zucchini, I believe. It's in a stress there with the summer, but the animals don't eat it. Even goats didn't eat it, and so you can still garden out in your pasture. So that's kind of fun. Again, diversity in the plants. I sometimes will off the milkweeds. Animals eat them. They have some toxins in them. I look at that being a benefit for deworming if you don't force them to eat too many. But monarchs, of course, depended on the milkweeds for their ecosystem. Here's just a butterfly eating or sipping on some manure. They get protein from that in the urine, and so they're kind of drawn to that. sometimes on a creek bank, if there's been a urine there, then you'll see a number of butterflies drawn to that area. That's just showing some diversity in a crepe ground or CRP that I'll be grazing in 2023 will come out. The livestock typically don't eat the echinacea or this, was it purple coneflower. They also don't like that wing stem there. But again, it's good for pollinators. Some people call it crown's beard. But we're trying to decrease that wing stem in the system. I plant some trees around for shade, and I plant chestnuts, and all that's just some being healed in. Now on to the normal presentation here. So my dad did pretty good with his cross fences, but not so much with the boundary fence. So whenever my brother and I took over, and now we're farming separate, but he, well, we decided to fence the boundary in 5-strand high tensile electric so that we could have goats to do some of the browse control. So the whole place is pretty well fenced that way. Back then we didn't have the high tensile woven wire. I would look close at that if I was doing it again today. The benefit of the high tensile woven is that, of course, less maintenance, and that's a huge thing, but also the post can be spread out to 25 feet, and that lowers the cost of the wire. And I'd recommend if somebody's doing that to get as broad of, use the 12-inch mesh instead of the tight mesh, just due to cost. And so what if the lambs or goat kids get out, they'll come back. So anyway, on the high tensile electric, I make all the wires hot just for ease of control. To do a ground negative fence, it's rather involved to have, you have to carry your ground system through the fence, throughout the gates and everything. So anyway, I make the bottom wire where it can be hot, but I don't typically turn it on unless there's a problem. That keeps some of the vegetation off. Yes, so I've got this low stocking rate of small remnants free roaming. That's where I'm headed today, and I advise most cattle producers, if they're going to add small remnants, to go at it that way. Don't stock more than one ewe per cow, or 1 to 2 nannies, goats, per cow, to keep from affecting the grazing of the cow. And then what the benefit of that is that your infrastructure, your cross fencing can still be one hot wire instead of multi-strands, and it lowers cost. However, you get the benefits of all remnants along with your cattle. I always like to locate the hub of an operation, and that's where a central point could be a rectangle along a road, or it could be the center where ridges come together. But where's the hub, where the fields come together? And that's a good place for a corral, a heavy use area, any number of uses. I'm not going to get into this other here, but anyway, it is a process, and it's dynamic, just like the stocking rate. Last year I had 400 ewes, or actually I think I had a little less than 300 ewes, and I'm down to 80 now because I am headed toward that, using a single hot wire instead of multi to control them. But I'm still stocked pretty high, 2 acres per animal unit, but comparing this to and a lot of cow operations are stocked that high. But I have the benefit on my place of that extra 24% stocking rate I can add due to having sheep. So in general, my calculations show that most operations, if they're producing 3 tons of production per acre, then about as high as they can stock is 2.4 acres per animal unit. So relatively, I'm stocked about the same. I have 16 permanent paddocks, and that's a good number for just about any farm. And then I'll divide that up into 45 or more temporary paddocks. And the stock density, the higher the stock density, the the more uniform the grazing and less spot grazing that you have. And you just, and then the manure distribution and all of that. This tall grazing at a low stock density is a bit of a problem because you're leaving behind the undesirables. And that makes it where your plant community may evolve to a lower quality. Introducing new species to an operation. This is a picture of my corral there on the right, and I'll get into that on the next picture. But I like to first bring them in, the new species, to the corral, because that's my best fencing. And then I'll have an offset electric to break them to hot wire. And then if they hadn't been weaned, that would help too. But also, if the cows have never seen sheep or goats or llamas, and you don't want to just drop them out the back gate, it might spook the cattle. I have a buddy did that, turned them out, and his cows showed up about 3 farms away. So anyway, they thought a dinosaur had been turned out on them. So give them a few days, and the dogs are also, the guardian dogs are also a new species that the cows may be leery of. So let them have some time to see it's not that bad being next to them. So here's the what I call the spiral corral, and it's just where a lane goes all the way around the corral, and I'll build all corrals this way. I like to have corrals in different portions of the farm that have different hubs, and that way if something gets pink eye or needs treatment, I can get it up easily. So this one actually goes into 2 lanes there at one point on the left, and those 2 lanes, you can search this. It's Canadian sorting video, and it really helps in sorting the calves from the calves. The 2-lane thing, and you have a high wire, or I use the board, and the calves go into that board, but the cows come on by you. Anyway, you can look at that video to see more of that. This is where back years ago, back 2006, this was drought year, and I was running single wire back then, and the goats had access to everything. But you can see there's not much left for the cattle, just a lot of stems there. So I'd gotten pretty high stocking on my goats at that point, and sheep would be worse than goats as far as competition for the cattle. Again, the cattle are the second grazer, so they won't hold up if you're holding them back and not holding back the sheep and the goats. Pecking order there, I've got cattle, goats, sheep. If you turn in, if you put in a field and the sheep are all around it, and then they're in a 5 months later, it's no sheep around it, it's just cattle, that's showing the pecking order there. So, that's just a picture of a field, and that looks like it's about time for them to come out of that field. It's grazed low enough. Bale grazing is kind of a thing that's getting a lot of press now, and it is a easier technique, and a technique for you just do it as if it's paddocks, but it's hay that you're grazing, and ideally there'd be some grazing along with the bales. In this case, I'm showing that you could hold back the cows with a 42-inch wire, creep graze, creep hay, the steers, and they would be stopped by 34-inch wire, and then the change your quality of hay or the amount of hay that these animals have access to by doing that. I was feeding some Serratia hay for natural deworming to the sheep and goats, and again, they would come through the 34-inch. That's one way to limit feed. Got a sex scene coming up, so some of you may want to turn your head. This is a temporary wire that I used. Now I've got a permanent fence there, but you can see where that brown grass is, where this fence used to be, and I just moved the fence over instead of having to weed eat or mow under it. And I recommend people put up temporary wire before they do their permanent fence, just to see where they want to locate their fences. I do put blocks, concrete blocks in the deeper tire tanks so that sheep and goats, kids can escape, because they will drown in those if you don't have an escape route. And these are somewhat by month, just to go through the year. But anyway, that's some cereal rye. I had a fella conservationist, grazing specialist on the place, and he said I didn't have enough residue in my grass. He was talking about fescue, and one way to do that, I thought, in quick and hurried, is just to add some cereal rye and let a lot of that return to the ground. And that does build organic matter. A little bit of cost in it, but it's one way to get there quick. Yeah, so we used to fertilize every year. Some fields I hadn't fertilized in 12 years with anything, and others I've put on 1.5 tons of chicken litter in that 12 years. Again, balance the fertility first. You can't get rewarded for your management if you don't have the fertility balanced, and the plant community will be off too. There's about $30 worth of NP and K in a roll of hay if it hits the field. And I've increased my stocking rate at home by about 38%. Earlier I said 24% for small ruminants, but this is due to the organic matter increase and the small ruminants and the rotation. This is just showing a gardener I worked with, and spiny amaranth, is a bad weed in pastures, and it's one of the easiest weeds to control. In this picture, he used some ryegrass mulch. I recommended cereal rye, but anyway, he uses ryegrass mulch, and he did replicated study and all, but on the left it had the ryegrass mulch, and on the right, I drew that blue line there, it didn't, and we got real good control, at least 90% control of the spiny amaranth. So the key is, as we know this from herbicide resistant weeds studying the amaranths, hot ground, bare ground is where, and fertile ground is where these amaranths grow. So we can reduce them pretty quick in good cover. So on the forage management side, I wanted to cover my thoughts on that real quick. Maintain those minimum grazing heights, like for fescue, it's 3 inches. Orchard grass be more like 4 inches. Remove 2 inches. And when a lot of people think, well, I'm maintaining, but actually put a rule on the ground, and 2 inches is more than you might think. If they're not doing high density, short duration grazing, periodically grazing it even lower is good, but I don't like to see more than 20% of the farm grazed low at any one time. My personal target grazing height is somewhere close to boot stage, right before it goes to seed, because that's, as we know, with hay cutting, that's the highest quantity and quality of forage. It's the balance of those two. Keep light to the desired species, shade out undesirables. Again, balance that nutrient. Long parallel fences, I tend to like to fence the long direction, and then temporary fences the between, and then water in every other fence row. And again, focus on where the tubs are needed. This is just a picture of some sheep and cattle sharing the water. I had good fescue going in. I think this was 2012. It was a drought, and you can see the fescue browned out. And I knew I had a problem whenever the sheep eyes started watering. If we had severe droughts year after year after year, goats hold up best to drought. Goats are great at controlling browse. You can see they've stemmed those briars, and they would just keep knocking those back if they stayed in there. Even though there's a lot of grass, I know it's not quality grass, but anyway, they're hitting those briars. This is some grazing corn. It was just drilled corn, and 4% organic matter field, so that's about 100 pounds of nitrogen for the year, because 25 pounds per 1% organic matter is what we can expect. So anyway, this is when it turned them in. They didn't even graze the corn. They were grazing around the edge. They figured it out later that day. And then this is showing where we strip grazed it, just put a 3-wire fence to hold back the sheep and goats and cows. Here's the sheep heads are low, the goat heads are high. They ate everything out there. The cattle are over in the corn. That's a little much on the grazing. I like to leave more dry matter behind than that, but that's where the corn had been grazed, and they cleaned it up a little too well. I was back grazing. That's a finished steer that I finished on that corn. This field's just showing brown grass shading green leaves is not good. So this was rest a little long, and typically if it's rest over 90 days, we begin to get into that. Depends on, you know, that's maybe going into summer, and going into winter, we can rest it 210 days easy enough and be okay, because anything's better than a snowball, of course. Goats tend to cause this mushroom shape, and it can fall over and kill them, so we need to put some restriction around. They waste a lot of hay too. I drew these lines here, but there's a fence where the red line is, and then the sheep again are segregated from the goats, and the cattle up at the top, and they'll revolve around and eat different areas, but that's just showing how they move throughout the field there. This is my own way of marking animals, and really a red tag means it needs to be sold, but I can mark that with a pig ear notcher and mark it didn't have a good hair coat by where I notched the top, and then if I notched the back, it could be a bad messy tail. A foot would be the bottom, and then the front might be bad famacha. Just another picture. The top third grazing during the growing season tends to be what I like to do, but whenever growth stops in the fall, we'll go to take half, leave half, and we'll keep rotating until we get down to about 2 inches. This is a mineral feeder. I'm not using that so much anymore. In fact, I've got this warning here on the bottom about copper, but there's some new work that came out about copper being good for parasite control. And I warn you that copper is a cumulative effect, and it builds up in the system over time. However, there are some people that are feeding high copper, and I'm even feeding high copper to the just cattle mineral. It's a 19 part per million, I believe, but there's people feeding higher copper to sheep. And in general, people say that wool sheep are more sensitive to copper than hair sheep. However, I know some wool sheep people that are feeding copper as well. So the hanging barrel, you can put your cattle mineral separate, and then the next one, this is how I used to do, and I still do this somewhat because sheep mineral is more expensive than cow mineral. Exclude the cattle with a 34-inch wire and hot wire, and they can get to that better mineral if you desire to do that. This is just a before picture and I had some pigs in that one, ran with the stock. My idea was for fly control, them to root in the manure and break up the fly cycle. They rolled in it instead, and then they would run to the water and jump in. So didn't quite, wasn't what I had in mind. However, they did break the fly cycle. So here's some, I like this prairie brome grass, Matua brome for shade areas, and I'll put some orchard grass and Virginia wild rye in those areas as well. And they're heavy manured, you know, if it's an area that livestock laid in. So it's one way of getting that back in a vegetative state. I like to watch the rumen field on the left side and make sure that's smooth and flattened if I'm trying to get good animal gains. There's the bale grazing again. The quick couplers, that's a Plasson valve. I get them from Kenco Fence. I think you can get them for about $13. You can get the whole rig for a setup. and that's much more economical than the other. Of course, they're not winterproof, but we need water more in the summer than we do in the winter anyway. So there's a Rubbermaid trough, 55-gallon trough with Gallagher. It's a brass valve. They'll break the plastic valve by stepping in it and all. But I like these for livestock. There I'm showing a disc blade covering up that access point. I don't do this so much anymore. Sometimes I do, but I use apple cider vinegar in the water now. But this is a chlorine tablet in a Gatorade bottle with slits cut in the bottle, and it keeps the water somewhat cleaner. You could put it in the head of a spring or something and clean the whole pipeline. The apple cider vinegar is supposed to help with all general health, just like with people. Some people take a tablespoon or more of apple cider vinegar every day. I've bought, I hate to mention how much I've bought, about 1,500 gallons of this stuff so far. I'm not feeding it as much as I once did, but there's the directions. I'll feed about a cup per 30 gallons of water, or sometimes mix it 50-50 with water, and they have access to it. And there they are doing a wine tasting, apple cider vinegar testing and tasting, and you can see them kind of reacting to it there. Natural fly control, and I know this is what some of you are interested in. One way of doing that is you can just mop on vegetable oil. You wouldn't think that would control flies, but it'll control them for, I don't know, 10 days or so. And a corral, you might as well do that if you have bad flies. I feed 1 pound of garlic per 50 pounds of mineral. That way you can select what kind of mineral you want to feed. Cinegar is a brand name of cinnamon and garlic mix mineral, and the cinnamon's supposed to act as an ionophore, and the garlic is for the fly control. But the mineral that I have access that has that in it is not a quality mineral, so I've kind of backed off of that. Now I've just started feeding this 1 pound of oregano along with 1 pound of garlic for face fly control, and I like that. And I will increase that rate some as the flies increase. Let's see, I don't think in here, but you can add, you can add cedar oil to that vegetable oil to get a little better fly control. Yeah, there's those pigs jumping in a tire trough. And I didn't have great fencing for the pigs, didn't have it all hot to hold them in. And when the acorns started dropping, they followed the acorns. So I warn you, when the acorns drop, you need to contain those pigs. I'm using them to control, to do some silvopasture, cutting out some bad trees and growing more grass. Pigs were a little nervous that day when I started a fire. But yeah, so cleaning up woods. In general, you want 50% light to the ground to grow more herbaceous vegetation under the trees, 60% for warm seasons, 50% for cool season grass. And if you're used to basal area with trees, then that's a 30 basal area or lower. There's some activity. That would be the tunneler. And I'm pointing out the value of the nutrients in that manure. It's not a waste product if it hits the right spot. A lot of value, 85, 57, 190 per cow per year. And I've done the math there. And you can fertilize any crop. If you're on an acre with 100 cows for 11 days, that will more than fertilize a crop. Yeah, so one of the rules of thumb is don't allow animals to take a second bite. However, if you're not doing high density grazing, you're going to be selecting for undesirable plants if you do that. This is an old hay field that a neighbor just let me start grazing, and it was low in phosphorus and potash due to all that haying. He just gave up on haying because he wasn't making enough yield, so I started grazing it. I own part of that land, and I actually own the land where the sheep are. And I've done some management through putting manure down and chicken litter and mowing and maybe a little seeding. But anyway, there's no fence there. The sheep are are just going to where the nutrient balance is better. The cattle are up there in some of the taller grass, and that's just because there's some hay up there. So it shows how nutrient balance can affect grazing preference. It's just showing some water points and how I fence off the water points. There's a aerial view, and a gate is about as cheap as building a welded wire panel with posts and boards. So usually I'll just put in a few more gates and make it work. This is showing a gate arrangement where 4 fences are coming together. It could be 4 or more, or however many fences are coming together, but there's no post in the center. It just makes a bigger access opening, and you can rotate animals about any direction you want with that. I don't have a picture here, but if you just have 2 posts, 2 gates, then put them diagonal to one another and hinge them that way, and you can rotate stock about any direction that way too. Predator control is a big issue. That's why a lot of sheep were dropped, and then all the mutton fed in the war. But 2 dogs minimum for predator control. I'm talking about Anatolian Shepherds or Great Pyrenees, Akbash, Maremma, those kind of dogs. 1 donkey per flock. And let's see what else there. That's the main thing. And then the cattle definitely have a predator control activity as well. You hear a lot of people, especially goat people, talk about grazing woods, and that's okay. They do like the vegetation in the woods, but it doesn't last very long. In recovery, it doesn't regrow unless there's light. So best fence those woods off, and if you're wanting to grow some grass in there, remove your undesirable trees so you get more light in there. That's a picture of some poison hemlock, and cattle have grazed that. At one time I thought that was really toxic, and it is toxic. However, I haven't seen any animals die. That's not that. I'm sure there are some cases where they have, but if they have selectivity, I haven't seen it to be an issue. Sheep will graze it too. I'm not sure about goats, and I've already talked about buttercup being a preference for sheep. Goats for the briars and coralberry. Coralberry is not their preference, or buckbrush is another name, but they will graze it some. And then treading is a big thing, especially with cattle, where we can tread out some of these with high density grazing. Marketing, I just touching on it. November 7th is when I breed the ewes and nannies, and part of this is because I have no shelter. So I want them to lamb in late March or April. So that's a big part of that. With cattle, I'll breed May 11th, and that's targeting I believe a February 20th calving. Not as prone to hypothermia as the sheep and lambs, or goats. Goats are the most prone to hypothermia. And I'm selling direct marketing most everything through River Cottage Farm. So they have a bigger market for beef than lamb, so that's part of the reason we're changing our species dynamics as well. There's unlimited potential with the high density, short duration grazing. I definitely haven't reached the full potential. Of course, higher fertility, higher nutrients, less weeds, animal flow with the fencing and the hubs, longer grazing season, less hay, and it costs about half as much to graze as feed hay. Need to manage those grazing heights, less floods and droughts, improve water quality, improve profits. So this is one of the final slides, but I don't want to, we more to go. So have that goal in mind. Work with the cycle by having cover, and recycle those nutrients like manure and residue and residual, and then energy flow by, again, managing the solar panel of vegetative cover, and then the biological process will also be better. So manage cover, less disturbance or grazing, shorter grazing periods because that's a disturbance, and longer recovery periods. Have diversity in the plants, and roots. Again, stock with flexibility. One thing I'm looking at now, since I'm moving more into a finishing operation, is if I could buy some 950 pounders in March and then sell them in June or July, that's double. That would allow me to double stock in the spring, which would meet the forage growth better. All right, and I've already touched on a lot of these others. Room and feel is important. Managing the manure, you want the manure to not splatter, not stack, but be a pumpkin pie. Yeah, so those are some things to look at. That's just a house of mine with some sheep grazing next to it. There's some unrolled hay. They got a little rough on some of that, and that'll either come, if it's too much residue, nothing will come up, and then later on you might get some weed in it, so you need to seed those areas. But if, in general, these areas would come back in crabgrass or Bermuda grass if it's present. That's just showing my fence line. There's some old perella mint. Perella mint is a sign of high fertility, but you know, it's an undesirable. This is across the line on the neighbors. It'd been grazed hard and maybe the pH wasn't quite what it should be. They've changed management now, lowered stock density and or lowered stocking rate, and it's improved a good little bit. There's a Zammer handle, which is that is my favorite handle. You can get that through Kenco fence if you like, but you can make it hot or cold, hook it away, and it's also a good picture of some red clover there, and some of that. That's some of the brome grass I was mentioning in a drier state. Okay. I don't like this poly braid. A lot of people do, but I got a bad batch or whatever. I don't like the braid wire. I like the turbo fence wire, Gallagher turbo 9-strand wire. This is where I had some sheep. I turned them in there again. They like to go over in tall vegetation. They got to running in a circle and they wouldn't even stop. I had to go out there and make them stop running in a circle. So that's how flock oriented they are. I didn't like doing this, but this was a shade area and a riparian area. It's not running water, but whenever it's a limited access area, but whenever they're not in there, I'll seed those areas down, just broadcast some seed, and due to the nutrient quality, I get a good stand. I don't know who set that beer bottle up there, but that's the thing about having your fence post flat. I have a pasture walk this year. It's October 16th. My email's on this page. I'm also on Facebook. I have a website with some resources on it, like I don't know, a number of things you could look up, and it's gregbrann.com. And there's the flyer for this year's pasture walk. So, Chris, that's all I got. I know I ran through that. I hope I didn't go too long.
Well, I think it was perfect, Greg. We appreciate that. Do have a question on the chat, and if anybody else has a question, feel free to type that in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. But can you recommend a source for the garlic, the oregano, those things? And
yeah, I should have said that. The webrestaurantstore.com, webrestaurantstore.com is the cheapest place I've found to get it. So yeah, that's where I get it. I get it in 25-pound bags, I believe, 20 to 25 pounds.
And is there a preference between the granulated or the powdered?
I use the powder. I've had some people say they used granulated and didn't get as good results. It will cake up on you, so I do like to keep it in a closed bag. And if you use your hands like I do to get it out, it sticks to them, kind of makes a mess, but you smell nice for a while.
Other questions? Well, Greg, you must have done a really good job answering.
Oh yeah, they fell asleep.
I don't think that's the case, but again, we appreciate you, Greg, spending time with us, and this is really good information. appreciate the Upper Cumberland agents who've helped us put this together, especially Chris Binkley, who I know reached out to you and invited you, Greg. We appreciate him. And again, next month for our session, mark your calendars, September 1st, and we'll talk about weed control. Pam has asked a question here, Greg. Does the garlic or oregano do a better job?
Well, the garlic's for the horn flies on their back, and the oregano's for the face flies. And yeah, so they're not really in competition, I don't think. I'm using them both. Yeah, I am pleased. I want to hear back from their experience. I used the Senegar, and it worked pretty good, and it was definitely easier, but I went back to my old technique.
Any other questions? Well, I will, once Greg sends me these slides, I'll be glad to email those out to everyone who's joined us today. And I'll also email you folks a link to the recording. That way, if there was something, I know we had to go through some of those pretty quickly. And so if there's something else you'd like to see or go back and review or pass along to a friend, you'll be able to do that. So, Greg, again, thank you for being with us.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Chris.